Hi everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm sharing my favourite ghostly and spooky reads just in time for Halloween. I've had a lot of fun pulling together quite a wide variety of books that I think would make brilliant Halloween reads, and I hope you enjoy my picks. I'd also love to hear what you'll be reading over the next few days if you're reading anything Halloween appropriate. But let's get going with my list. So first of all, I mentioned in my What to Read in Autumn video that this month in October I really wanted to read The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I absolutely adored her book We Have Always Lived in the Castle, so this was next on my list to read, and I did read it and I really enjoyed it, and it was definitely a perfect read for Halloween month. It's an amazing ghost story. One of the critics of the book also said that stepping into Hill House is like stepping into the mind of a madman. That's a quote from Stephen King, and it's so true. This was an extraordinary read. I have to admit, I prefer We Have Always Lived in the Castle, but I'm still so glad I read this book. It's about a man who's interested in spirits and ghosts, and he hears of a haunted house and he decides to go to this house, rent it for a few months, and invite a group of people who he thinks might be spiritually aware, so to speak, who might also help to manifest the presence that's in this house. And one of the young women who he invites is called Eleanor, and she's had a very unhappy, restricted life, taking care of her mother who was sick. Now she lives with her sister and her sister's husband, and she's never had much of her own life. So she sees this trip to Hill House as a real adventure and a chance to break out on her own. As soon as she arrives at the house, though, she definitely senses an atmosphere. This is one of the best books about a country house, especially haunted country house, but it's also about how fear itself can send you mad, and it is an incredible look into the mind of someone who is slowly losing their reason. Eleanor almost becomes possessed by the house, with catastrophic results. The ending is quite a shocker, though really you know that it's not going to end well. But it's really such an interesting read. I think Shirley Jackson is a remarkable writer. That's just one of the reasons I really enjoy her books, is they're so well written. This was nowhere near as scary as I thought it would be. I'm really wimpy when it comes to scary books, so I was nervous about reading this, but it actually isn't that scary. However, it still is a great ghost story, and I would really recommend reading it. And then, of course, I had to mention one of my favourite Agatha Christie books, which is Halloween Party, the perfect book to read at this time of year. A young girl is murdered at a Halloween party. She's drowned horribly while she's bobbing for apples. And just before she's killed, she was bragging at this party that when she was younger, she'd seen a murder committed, but because she was so young, she hadn't really taken in what she'd seen. Now she dies soon after that, so Hercule Poirot comes to investigate, and he soon realises that this young girl's death is linked to a previous murder. There's a character called Miranda in this book, another young girl, and I really like her character, so that's of course just an added bonus for me as well. But I love to listen to this on audiobook every Halloween. It just really sets the mood for me, and it's a great Hercule Poirot mystery, so I definitely recommend this. And then another book that starts out on Halloween night is The Stranger Diaries by Ellie Griffiths. I actually read the book on my Kindle because my mum has all of Ellie Griffiths' books on Kindle, and I've just really started getting into her books after reading The Postscript Murders. I wanted to read The Stranger Diaries, and now I've also read one of the Ruth Galloway murder mysteries as well, the first one. And I'm absolutely loving her books. I'm really getting into them. And I so recommend The Stranger Diaries. It's a brilliant read. Like The Postscript Murders, it's quite a literary mystery. And throughout the book, Ellie Griffiths has woven in this traditional Victorian ghost story that she's written, that she's done a brilliant job of it. And this ghost story starts on Halloween night, and it's about these horrible deaths that occur every Halloween to people that a man knows in his life, and he feels the curse is coming to get him. So it's a really brilliant, creepy Victorian ghost story, and how it's related to the book and the plot of The Stranger Diaries is that a murderer starts committing crimes that echo the murders that happen in this mystery. So it's a brilliant book. I really recommend it. It kept me absolutely gripped. I had to stay up late to finish it, and a lot of the events in all of the book occur around Halloween. So it's a perfect story to read at this time of year, and I'm really getting into Ellie Griffiths' books now. I'm just absolutely loving them. They're not too gory or gruesome as well. They're a bit more in the style of the cozy murder mystery, even though they are modern crime books. But like I said, The Postscript Murders is quite a literary crime story. There are all these references to Victorian ghost stories and also to Wilkie Collins and things like that. So I really enjoyed it for that reason too, and really recommend it. And then this I thought would be a really fun choice for Halloween. It's called My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyenkan Braithwaite. I hope I'm saying her name right. But I read this, I don't know if it was last year or the year before when it first came out. I can't remember. But I absolutely loved it. It's such a strange sounding story because it's about a young woman in Nigeria who protects and essentially cleans up after her sister, who she suspects is a serial killer because her sister keeps killing off her boyfriends. And it sounds like such a strange tale, but it's actually brilliant, and it really is about sisterhood and female solidarity. It's set in Nigeria, and you really come to empathize for the poor narrator in this situation. But somehow Braithwaite manages to write the story in a way that you understand why she does cover for her sister, and you really come to sympathize with her, although you also wonder what the future will hold. And to a certain extent, her loyalties are tested in this book. But it's really, some parts are really quite funny, if very sort of dark humour, but I absolutely raced through it. It's a really slim read, and I think again it would just be a really fun sort of Halloween story, and yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this one. Then I've been rereading The Picture of Dorian Gray this month, and again I think this makes a brilliant Halloween read. It's such a strange story. I admit that I prefer Oscar Wilde's plays. I mean, I just adore the importance of being earnest and an ideal husband. But this book is much darker than his plays and a very strange story. It's about a beautiful young man who wishes that he will never age. And a portrait is painted of him. And in fact, what happens is his wish comes true, and the man never ages, but his portrait does. And even more horrifically, this man's corruption of his soul, Dorian's aging not only of his physical body, but of his soul, is reflected in the portrait. And although Dorian Gray appears so youthful and beautiful and innocent on the outside, his portrait reveals a very different, cruel and unpleasant side to his personality. Like I said, it's a very strange read, but I still really enjoy it, and it's definitely got that creepy quality that makes it a great Halloween read. It's also stuffed full of some of Oscar Wilde's most famous quotes and brilliant epigrams, and I really do recommend it. And yes, it's just a sort of creepy story that is great for Halloween. I've mentioned this book before in my What to Read in October, but I'm mentioning it again because Halloween is an important date in this book, and it's a great twisty-turny sort of story that has a great surprise at the end of it that I really enjoyed. It's quite a spooky tale in some ways as well, because it's about a young woman. It's set in the 1960s, and she is running her own bookshop with a friend of hers. She's single, but she thinks that she's very happy with her choice to remain single and the life that she's living, being her own businesswoman. But suddenly she starts dreaming when she goes to sleep at night, dreams that in fact seem very much like reality. And in this dream, she's married and has children, and reality and this dream world really start to blend until she starts wondering what's real and what isn't in this book. I really loved it. It's a great light read that will definitely keep you turning the pages. And like I said, Halloween figures in this book too. So it's a great read for this time of year. And then another rather creepy book that I read last winter and really enjoyed is Awakenhurst by Michelle Paver. This book starts out with a murder. It's narrated by a young woman, and at the beginning of the book, her father commits a horrific crime. And then you go back in time, and much of the book builds up to you knowing why this crime has been committed. And it's a great Gothic story. I really enjoyed it. It's a perfect book to curl up with in the long winter evenings, and it's a brilliant Halloween read. There's a wonderful sense of place. Michelle Paver builds up the atmosphere so well in this book. Again, it's set in a sort of big English country house that's surrounded by fenland, and she describes the landscape so well, and it's quite creepy landscape. There are eels that sort of slide through all of this very Gothic style landscape, and it's quite a sort of chilling book, but I really enjoyed it, and it would make an excellent read for Halloween weekend. Then a bit of a lighter choice, but a really fun read, is Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner. And this book is about a middle-aged spinster aunt called Laura, but her family always call her Lolly. And she was very close to her father, but on his death, she moves in with her sister and the sister's husband and children, and becomes a very typical spinster aunt. However, every autumn, Lolly starts to feel this inexplicable urge to go to places of wilderness, to move back to the countryside, but she feels this real sort of calling that she doesn't understand. And then one day, it's a scene that I love in the book, she steps into a greengrocer's and she sees these flowers. I can't remember if they're dahlias or chrysanthemums, but sort of typical autumnal flower, and also some birch leaves, and she buys all of these these flowers in an extravagant gesture. And she asks where these branches of birch leaves have come from. And then she decides to move to the place that the leaves come from in the English countryside. And once she's there, she suddenly realizes that she is in fact a witch and that Satan is her master. This is where the book takes a distinctly odd turn. I think some people take it a bit too seriously. It really is just quite a quirky sort of tale. And she meets Satan in this book, and he turns out to be very different from what she was expecting. But she accepts that she is now his servant because she is in fact a witch. And it's just actually a very feminist text. It's the sort of book that once you've read really stays with you, and I absolutely love it. It's such a sort of fun, quite light-hearted read, but there's definitely a lot of depth to it as well. And Sylvia Townsend Warner writes so interestingly about what it's like to be a single woman, but also how almost all women feel this sort of inner power, inner strength that Laura translates as witchcraft, but she feels she has this source of magic and of power, and that is a distinct part of her womanhood, in fact. And many of the members of the village in which she goes to live are also witches and warlocks, and they accept her into their flock. But it's really such a fun book. Again, it's very slight, and I would really recommend it, and it is definitely the perfect read for Halloween. And so I just adore the cover on this edition. It's just so perfectly autumnal. But yes, another one I would really recommend. Then at this time of year, I love to read some spooky short stories, and Roald Dahl, I think, writes some of the best creepy, unexpected stories. And this collection of his is called Tales of the Unexpected. They're quite dark, his stories, but I find them absolutely fascinating. Daphne du Maurier is another writer whose short stories I love to read at this time of year. The short story Don't Look Now is brilliantly creepy. It was also made into a film. And Roald Dahl's stories remind me of Daphne du Maurier's in that they have that same dark, mysterious quality, and I really recommend them. They're perfect to just pick up and read the odd one at this time of year. If you're just used to his children's books, then this is quite different, although I think some of that dark quirkiness obviously does come out in his children's literature as well. But it's much darker in the short stories, but they're so brilliantly crafted. He is such a brilliant writer, and these short stories are just masterfully plotted, and the twists at the end are always so good. So I really recommend his short stories. And they are short stories for adults, by the way. This is definitely adult literature, not children's, with his short stories. But talking of more short stories and children's book authors, Ines is of course a very famous children's writer. I mean, I adored The Five Children in It when I was young, and then The Railway Children. So many brilliant books that she wrote for young people. But I don't think so many people are familiar with her short stories and her ghost stories in particular for adults. And some of them do sometimes crop up in ghost story anthologies, which I love. But this is a little collection of just Nesbit's ghost stories. It's published by Grey Ladies Press. I'll hold it up so you can see, which is one of my favourite little small independent publishers, and I was really pleased to get this volume of Ines short stories. I haven't read them all yet, so this is a book that I'm looking forward to getting into myself over the weekend, because I think that they'll be spooky but also fun reads, so I'm looking forward to this. Then this month I reread The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, and I often reread this book in October in the lead up to Halloween because I think it's one of the best ghost stories. I've spoken about it in one of my previous videos this month about unreliable narrators, so I won't say too much more about it. But it's about a governess who goes to take care of two small children in a big English country house, and there she believes that she starts to see ghosts who are trying to possess the children's souls, and she feels that she has to protect her charges from these spirits. But events take a very dark turn, and at the end of the book you're left wondering whether it's true that a haunting really happened or whether the governess was just descending further and further into madness. It's such a good read. It's a very slim book too. This edition has both Daily Miller and The Turn of the Screw in it, but The Turn of the Screw is really just novella length, and it's a great book to just curl up with one evening and race through. I really recommend it. Then for more short stories, you know how much I love P.D. James, and I think she is a master of the short story. This collection is called Sleep No More, 6 Murderous Tales, and I love the autumnal cover by Angela Harding on this book. I think it's absolutely gorgeous, and this has some of her best short stories in it. I really enjoy this collection. If you like mysteries, then I think you would really enjoy this, and again, it's just a really fun read for this time of year. I've mentioned this short story collection on my What to Read in the Autumn video, and it's the ghost stories of Edith Wharton. I love Victorian and Edwardian ghost stories. I think that they're always so much fun to read, even if sometimes they do scare me a bit. I find Charles Dickens especially writes some very scary ghost stories, but I do still enjoy them. And I didn't know what a brilliant ghost story writer Edith Wharton was, but last year I got this collection and I read about half of it, I think, and I still have a few more to read, but I'm really enjoying it, and I want to go back and reread some of the others that I read last year. There's some really creepy ones at the beginning that I still remember, but yes, I really recommend this collection of short stories too. And then one of the books that really got me started on my love for reading ghost stories at this time of year is this collection I got a few years ago, and it's called Classic Ghost Stories. And it's ghost stories by Charles Dickens, H.G. Wells, Edith Wharton, M.R. James, and many more. So it's a really brilliant collection of mainly Victorian and Edwardian ghost stories. And if you're new to that sort of genre, then I would really recommend starting with this book, because there's a great variety of writers. You get some of the most famous ghost stories in here too. There's a very well-known one by Charles Dickens. I think it's the first one. Yes, The Signalman. And I think that's the scariest story of the lot, actually. This one really did scare me. But the whole collection is brilliant. There's some good M.R. James ones too. He was so famous for his ghost stories. And I think there's also Elizabeth Gaskell. Edith Nesbit is in here too. And yes, Elizabeth Gaskell is in here as well. Margaret Oliphant is as well. Arthur Conan Doyle and Mary Elizabeth Braddon. So lots of great writers and really good ghost stories. So I really recommend it. And again, the cover is stunning. The illustration is by Ed Clues, and he's an artist I really like as well. So it's a beautiful book, but also a brilliant read for this time of year. I read one of the stories every night, I think throughout sort of November a few years ago, and I absolutely loved it. And then another collection of short stories that I think would be super for Halloween is Nudibranch by Irenison Okoji. I read this last year and I interviewed Irenison on my podcast, which was so much fun. She's such a brilliant short story writer, and it was really interesting to talk to her about crafting short form fiction. And why I think her stories would be so good for Halloween is because they have an incredible surreal, dark quality to them. They are really the stuff of nightmares more than of dreams. And there are two stories in this that I think would be especially good. I think it's is it the second or the third one in here? I think it's maybe yes, it's the third short story called Point and Trill, and there's a horrible car chase that happens in this one when a young man realizes that his wife and her lover are trying to kill him for his money. But it's really surreal, but such a good story. And then another favourite one in here is called Grace Jones, and Irenison actually won a prize for this short story, and it's about a woman who dresses up as Grace Jones. She sort of dresses as a Grace Jones impersonator and goes to a party, but it ends very badly. But yes, this is just such a sort of curious collection of stories that reading them reminds me of looking at a sort of surrealist painting. There are definitely lots of elements of the bizarre in here, but she's just such a good writer, and I think a lot of these stories would just make excellent Halloween reads. So the paperback is actually out in November, and Dialogue Books kindly sent me the paperback. I already have the hardback. They sent me the paperback in advance of its release. But yeah, I definitely recommend looking out for this one in November. And then this little collection is also a great book for Halloween. It's called Quaint and Curious Volume, Tales and Poems of the Gothic. And this is just a really fun little collection of poetry, short stories, but all with a real sort of Gothic theme to them. I think Edgar Allan Poe poetry features in here. Yes, The Raven is in here. And it's just quite a fun little collection. There's an introduction by Sarah Perry, and it just looks beautiful too. I don't know if you can see that. I love the colour, and it's just a great spooky collection of poetry and stories, so another one to get you in the mood. And then next up, another fantastic collection of stories is the Virago Book of Witches, edited by Sharuka Hussain. And this is such an interesting volume because it features stories from many different cultures and from all around the world. And what's fascinating is how throughout the world and sort of throughout ages and cultures, there are always some stories about women as witches or as some sort of outsider. And it's really interesting to read this collection for that reason. I've read a few of these and I want to read more because I was really enjoying them. So if you want some stories that are a bit more international in scope, then I would really recommend picking this up for your Halloween reading. And then I wanted to include one of my favourite children's books I absolutely loved when I was little, and this would make a perfect read for Halloween, either for any young people in your life or even just to read yourself, because it's quite a fun and sweet story. And it's called Goblino, the Witch's Cat by Ursula Moray Williams. And this is such a funny, sweet story. It's about a cat who is a witch's cat, but he doesn't want to be. He's a terrible witch's cat. And at the start of the story, the witch and his sister, who is a much better witch's cat, they both fly off on their broomstick and leave poor Goblino on his own. And so he goes and tries to find a nice family where he can be a contented, normal cat who just enjoys drinking milk and maybe chasing the odd mouse, but that would be about it. And it's just a really sweet story, and I loved it when I was a child. I think this is a lovely book to read to young children or to help early readers. It's a great book for a child to have a go at reading. It's a sort of early chapter book style, and I think it's a lovely story. Then my mum mentioned this book in our last book club chat about Affinity by Sarah Waters, and it's the Victorian chaise longue by Margarita Lasky, and I think that this would actually make a really good Halloween read. It's about a woman in, I think, the sort of 1930s who falls asleep and then she wakes up back in time, and sort of body of another woman, and she's not physically tied, but she cannot get up from this chaise longue, Victorian chaise longue, and she's sort of imprisoned by the chaise longue. And it's a very strange book, but really quite a haunting read. And for that reason, I think it's an excellent Halloween pick. Again, it's very slim, just novella length, and I really recommend, if you haven't picked this one up yet, I think Margarita Lasky is an amazing writer. She's one of my favourite authors that Persephone Books republish, and I really would recommend getting this book. It's a very strange story, but quite a little gem. So yeah, I recommend this one. Frankenstein, of course, is a real Gothic, almost horror story about the monstrous, about human hubris, and the atmosphere in it is amazing. There's an incredible chase scene across sort of frozen mountains and frozen wastelands that is really memorable and makes a good Halloween read for obvious reasons. There have been so many TV series, films, retellings of Frankenstein, but I read this for the first time, I think a couple of years ago now, and I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed the original story. I think all of us feel like we know the story already, even if we haven't read the book, because it's so much a part of Western culture and literature, but returning to the original book was much more touching than I thought it would be, and I enjoyed it so much more than I thought I would too. So I really recommend, if you haven't read Mary Shelley's masterpiece, and it's amazing too to think she wrote this, I think, when she was only about 19 years old, which is truly incredible. But yes, if you haven't read this, then I really recommend it as a brilliant Halloween or winter read. And then finally, I've mentioned this book in my What to Read in the Autumn already, but I have to mention it in my Halloween video too, because it's such an appropriate pick. This is a non-fiction book. It's called The Ghost, A Cultural History by Susan Owens. And this looks at why ghosts and ghost stories have been such an important part of Western culture, particularly in Britain. Almost since the dawn of telling stories, we have been telling ghost stories. And Susan Owens examines why ghosts are so important within British culture, and particularly within literature She does also touch on ghosts in art as well. And it's an absolutely fascinating read because it almost is a history of English literature because ghosts crop up so much, and it's told in sort of chronological order. And I found it really fascinating for that reason, but also her particular insights are really wonderful. She's such a great writer, and I love the mix of literary criticism with an examination of some artwork in here as well as history. It's just such a good read, and looking at English literature through the specific lens of looking at ghosts in literature was really interesting and makes this the perfect Halloween read. Really recommend it. And then finally, I thought I'd share a couple of books that I haven't read yet but want to read and am reading this week. And the first one is The Haunting of Almafield. I started reading this and I'm really enjoying it so far. It's about a woman who believes that her home is being haunted, or that even that she specifically herself is being haunted by a poltergeist. This is based on a real life story. This happened in the 1930s. And in this book, Kate Summerscale examines the life of Alma Fielding and why this incident happened, why she believed in this haunting, what actually went on. And it's also a book about the ghost hunter who started to investigate this case. So it's a book about him and about Alma Fielding, but it's also about the fascination the British public had at that time in ghosts and otherworldly spirits and seances. After World War I, when there'd been so much loss, so much death, many more people turned to seances and mediums in the hope of being able to connect with loved ones in another world. So it's also a really interesting examination of a particular time and a sort of collective interest and vulnerability in a way, and I'm really enjoying it. And having just read Affinity by Sarah Waters, which also deals with seances and ghosts, it's really interesting to read this non-fiction book now, even though it's about a time a bit later than when Affinity was set. It deals with some of the same subject matter, so I'm really enjoying it. And then this book, which is called Pine by Francine Toon, starts out actually on Halloween. It's set in the Highlands and it's about a young girl who lives with her father. And I think her mother has disappeared or something a few years ago, and part of the book is about the girl starting to wander, wanting to find out what happened to her mother. But it starts on Halloween when she's coming back from trick-or-treating with her father, and suddenly out into the middle of the road this young woman appears who looks half-starved, and she's very young and she's only clothed in a dressing gown. And her father seems to recognize this woman, but the young girl really doesn't understand what's going on. So it reminds me almost of the start of one of those great Scandi crime dramas. You know, the Highland setting is really atmospheric. I've only read the first few pages so far, but this is definitely one I'm hoping to finish soon because it's such an appropriate read for this time of year. But anyway, there's my very extensive list of books that I think make great spooky reads for Halloween. I hope you've enjoyed my suggestions. Let me know if you have any books that you love to read around Halloween, or if you like the sound of any of the ones I've recommended. I'd love to know what you think. Do give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel, which you can do by clicking on my face that pops up on the screen around here. But I'll be back again very soon with another bookish video, and until then, goodbye.